Entertainment, ZEE Entertainment, Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam. The world is my family.
Thank you so much.
How are you?
I'm good, and you? I'm
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to session 3 on the third day of the 9th ZEE Jaipur Literature Festival at Charbagh. Before we begin, the same announcements. The central aisle must be kept clear for your own safety and security. Please keep your phones on silent mode, and if you must take an urgent call, please do so outside the venue. Give up your seats for somebody who might not be able to stand. And now to the session. The session is titled The Global Novel and is sponsored by ZEE Entertainment. We are delighted to introduce Aleksandar Hemon, David Grossman, Sulaiman Addonia, and Sunjeev Sahota, and Chiki Sarkar, who will be moderating the session, along with Margaret Atwood. Ladies and gentlemen, our panelists.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's going to be, I think, a fascinating session, though I want to start with an admission. I think most of us on this stage don't wholly believe, or we certainly have questions about the subject of our conversation. Can you hear me better now? Is this okay? Good. So I don't know whether you heard me, but we all have questions about this subject and what it means. We're not wholly sure. So I'm going to break up this conversation. As you know, what we're talking about is the novel. Why did it become the preeminent, if it has, the literary form of our age from its beginnings in the 18th century? And what does it mean for it to be a global novel? And on stage are all these writers who you all know about. I'm going to introduce them shortly. But I'm going to introduce them for the sake of this event with their nationalities. So you get a sense of how global, if there is such a thing as a global novel, all is global practitioners. So I'll start from my right. Colm Toibin is an Irish novelist. And we have a lot of hyphenated novelists here in terms of their nationalities. But Colm is Irish, shortlisted for the Booker millions of times. And his most recent novel is Nora Webster. Margaret Atwood, I think, absolutely needs no introduction. Except she is our goddess. And when all of us are going to be in doubt, we will just look at Margaret, I think. And Margaret has been, of course, the chief key speaker at the opening of the festival. And she's a Canadian novelist. Aleksandar Hemon, who we're going to call Sasha, is a Bosnian-American novelist. Again, I got that hyphen right. Most recently, the author of The Making of the Zombie Wars, again, a recipient of numerous prizes, one the most famous being the MacArthur Genius Grant, which I love saying just because it's called the Genius Grant. So we have an official genius here. David Grossman is perhaps Israel's one of his most important novelists. The prizes, again, are too innumerable to mention. His last big novel was The Extraordinary to the End of the Land. Sulaiman is hyphenated, and hyphenated more than anyone else in this panel. He's British, Sudanese, Eritrean.
Lebanese and something? Sudanese.
And has written a strange and extraordinary novel called The Consequences of Love. You'll probably the novel that you might have heard least about, but extraordinary in a weird novel in all kinds of ways. And Sunjeev Sahota, again, British Indian, Booker shortlisted, and the author most recently of The Year of the Runaways. So here are all these people around us from all over the world. And I'm going to just take the first part of that conversation. When and how did the novel become the most popular literary form? And I'm going to start with Colm, because Colm teaches humanities. And then I'll have various people say, well, I don't agree, I hope. But
I think part of the power of the novel arises from its hybrid origins. In other words, that it includes dialogue, as the theatre does. It includes monologue, or can include monologue, as, for example, Hamlet's soliloquies can. It includes confession, which, of course, religious texts did. It includes poetry, of course, because it's written in rhythm, so that it includes many matters without excluding anything, and that it arose at the same time as a sense of the self arose, the self as somebody who could confront destiny, choice, chance, who could actually win, who could make money, who could arise from nowhere and become somebody very big and important and could lose everything. It's a secular space, the novel. So in other words, it came almost against the religious, the idea of the religious text. It's a cold place, the novel, for religion. It's not good at dealing with miracles. God doesn't come down and rescue the characters. Instead, they inherit money. They lose money. They fall in love. No one loves them. Everyone loves them. And so it began, in a way, in a time of secularization, in a time when money, the ways of making money were changing, and in a time when choices and chances were becoming increasingly available. And so that all of those things, all of those ingredients and some more gave it its power and gave it its staying power, because it remains a hybrid form. There is no single way to write a novel, and there is no single way to read a novel, so that it can include multitudes.
But Colm, of course, the interesting thing about the novel is that from its very origins, it was popular. And Margaret was, when we were having, we all met and talked a little bit before this event. And Margaret, you were mentioning that, from the very moment the novel was written, lots of bad novels were written, lots of writing, that the novel, the idea of the novel and popular writing, in a way, go hand in hand. And I wondered if you wanted to say something about that. I think you've got a mic.
I've got a mic. I do. I have a mic. Does it work? Yes. So yes, I think what I was talking about was that we tend to think of the 19th century as the age of literary masterpieces, and we remember, the kinds of things you get taught in college. But from the instant the Gutenberg press was invented, an absolute ocean of popular forms, bad writing, pornography, religious tracts, shocking tales, penny dreadfuls. This ocean poured forth, and we've just forgotten about it. So we go around bemoaning, we go around saying standards have declined. Actually, they haven't. They're about the same. There's still an ocean of bad writing, as I'm sure we'll all agree, but it's writing. There were so many novels written in the 18th century that people became addicted to them. It was a well-known addiction. It was considered an illness, novel reading. And in the 19th century, novels were preached against by religious people. They were considered to be a low form of writing, and very bad for young ladies to read too many of them, because it softened their already tiny and soft brains. in pioneer societies such as those of North America, reading itself was considered a useless, and it was considered a waste of time. You would be much more usefully employed doing the dishes or milking the cow than reading. So it was considered a frivolous type of thing to do. I think it is with Flaubert and then into the age of Henry James that the novel then becomes an art form. It becomes considered something that you can make into art. Before that time, it was poetry that was the high form.
So let me ask another question, and maybe Sasha, you can answer that. Why did people feel that they could write novels? What you have is a moment where lots and lots of people are beginning to write novels, right, from the moment of its growth, and a lot of it is junk, some of it is wonderful. And as we read Jane Austen, there are hundreds and thousands of bad novels that we've forgotten wherever.
Well, we think they're bad, but other people might like them.
Yeah, no, exactly. So I take that back. But let's say that, so the idea of the novel came with the idea that many people could write, all kinds of people could write, and that the novel, even as it happened in a fast and furious space. And these things happen together. Sasha, why is that?
Well, let me give you a definite answer. I don't know. But I think that's very important to understand that novel or literature as such, at least the modern literature in the past 200 years, it's a public space, and it's closely connected to development of the very notion of public space, and therefore with press, and therefore with this, the Penny Dreadfuls and all these bad novels, they all were part of this public space. There was some kind of hierarchy within it, or at least it developed at some point. But all that writing was poured into that public space. And the existence of the public space, obviously, is related to the development of the idea of democracy and equal rights and, the equality of people who can have equal access to that public space, provided that they meet some, citizenry requirements, as it were. And I think that the decline of the novel, to the extent that it has declined, is related to the demise of the press and the demise of a public space that is organized around the written word. I also think that the development of the novel, to the extent there is a development, it's not equally distributed. It operated differently in France and the United Kingdom and Russia, let alone these smaller European nation states. In European nation states, the novel, as an important element of the public space, was essential, as Benedict Anderson suggested, he died last year, it was essential in imagining the community that was a nation, that was equally spread along the whole territory of a country, and the hierarchies that were going with feudal systems were disposed of for the sake of at least the idea of democracy. So that the possibility of everyone reading the newspapers at the same time in various places in the same territory was just a step, the novel was just a step behind that, the notion of a novel being read by all the literate people and cultural leads, therefore, within the same territorial domain. So that in a community of people bound by language, bound by culture, bound by the same public space could be imagined because of the press and because of the novel. And the rise of the novel, therefore, is closely, at least in Europe, is connected to the rise of nation state. With the demise of nation state, or at least weakening, the novel has also lost some power.
Do you agree, David? Do you think the novel's lost its power?
No, and here's the proof, in a way, yes. But I think that we live in a world that is dominated majorly by the mass media. They formulate to us the ideas and the images, and there's something tricky about this term, the mass media. It's a term that was coined by sociologists, I think, on the 30s of the 20th century. And when we hear these words, mass media, we think that it's a media that is meant for the masses, but actually it is a media that turns human beings into masses, and sometimes also into a mob, by using Thank you. By using certain passwords that are common to everyone, by gluing us together in a feeling of such a collective. It's a false and imagined collective, but we feel comfortable in it, and we feel a little self-righteous in it, and we feel how good we are and how the others are bad. This is the feeling we get when we read usually the weekend papers in Israel, or when we watch all those big television networks. Now, I think that in such atmosphere, literature comes and feels the need for us to be unique in a unique way, because if, you know, billion of people are reading the India Times or the New York Times at the same moment, in a way they all feel the same. They all feel belonging to this big imagined collective. While if 10,000 people are reading the same book, my feeling is that this book reads each and every one of them in a different way. It allows very intimate, personal contents to surface.
So because we're talking about the novel and not literature as a whole, David, I'm going to push you one more time before I move on to, is that, you know, you're making a case for literature. You're making a case for literature and its role and its use in modern life and in all life. But what is it specifically about the novel? You know, we're here to talk about novels as opposed to plays or essays or poetry that makes it the form in which most of these people sitting here would rather consume stories than anything else. Is there something specific about the novel? David, I can, if you're taking sides with Sulaiman, maybe you should have a try at that answer.
Before I answer that, can I just say that I was actually exposed to cinema before I was exposed to a novel, because when I was a young boy, I was growing up in a refugee camp.
Can everyone
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? So when I was a young boy, I was growing up in a refugee camp. So we didn't have books, we didn't have. Okay. We didn't have books, we didn't have libraries. So, and every year we would go to the city, and we would watch an Indian cinema, Indian films. So I was, you know, so when I was going back to the refugee camp, I sort of had an Indian imagination, in a sense of, you know, of how you develop a script, of how you conceive ideas, and so, you know, a novel as a form for me, it's not a straightforward thing. So again, when I went to Saudi Arabia from Sudan, you know, with all, you know, for us, we had to take risks to read novels, because we had to go to smugglers to get, you know, the kind of books that we wanted. So again, it was kind of, it wasn't accessible in the way it is here in the West, or, you know, in different countries. It was something that you really you had to fight for it, you have to take risks. So in that sense, I don't know to the extent to the extent to which it is a popular form in the part where I come from. A, because of its lack of, it's not available. Two, it's because of the religious context of all the kind of politics that makes it very, very difficult for people to get their hands on.
Sunjeev, do you agree, as someone who's grown up with Punjabi immigrants, do you think the novel is actually relevant in one part of your upbringing?
I think the novel's clearly started off, I think, in the Western... Can you hear me? Is that any better? Yeah? Okay, I'll hold it up here. I mean, it is a public space novel, but it's also the most intimate sort of experience that almost you can have. You know, you're with this book in a theatre of one, and every book is different for every reader. And for me, I think the rise of the novel, it goes back to what I think Colm and Margaret were saying about religion. I think you can almost perhaps chart the times when sort of, you know, in the West at least, Jesus began being seen as almost like a fictional character rather than sort of a given, and the sort of the demise of religion and the rise of secularism and sort of the novels rise alongside that. And I think it connects to, for me, I think it connects to this idea of the suspension of disbelief, which used to be put on, used to be needed when it was a deeply religious society, and that suspension of disbelief has almost got transferred to the novel. When I read a novel, at least, it's that the requirement to believe in this world that the writer has made up requires, I'd imagine, a lot of the sort of the feelings and the processes and the mental processes that might have been required if someone of deep faith in the past. So I'm not sure I'd go as far as to say that the novel replaced religion, but I think certainly some of the things that required to make a society religiously tenable are there in the novel. And actually, it is not there is no God in the novel. And but I wonder if that's almost because reading a novel is almost slightly a miraculous experience in itself anyway, so to add any more God-esque sort of features would sort of destroy that sort of miracle and that magic. So I think those intimacy, the novel sort of taking over or taking on some of these religious aspects that were there in society in the past, perhaps have contributed to the novel being seen as, rightly or wrongly, as the form that people go to sort of know themselves.
I feel like all of us, not me, but there's been big words: religion, secularism, soliloquies, monologue, lots of big words, mass media. Isn't it something simpler? Do we read? So I'm going to be completely crass and vulgar and say that I think we read novels because it does storytelling and it does people better than any other art form. And I think that people certainly when I began reading novels as a teenager, I read it because I thought, there were people on these pages that felt, the first men I fell in love with were people in novels. They were real. And I'm sure that's the case of many, you fall in love with someone, you hate someone. I was saying to Colm, I just read The Testament of Mary, his wonderful book. I couldn't read the crucifixion scene, it was too painful. It's alive. And that actually what the novel did was that it did those two things better than anything else, which is why people flocked to it. And Sasha, when we were talking, you think that actually that no longer is the case, that the power of long-form storytelling has diminished, and that actually we're beginning to see the TV show take on some of that mantle.
Well, I don't think, I think that the monopoly of the novel as the long narrative form that deals with human experience, particularly contemporary human experience, is no longer tenable, at least in the United States. And I also think that it's not equally distributed again. So I'll just talk about the United States as it is now. I think the novel and the television and the press has different importance, different value in different social contexts. So it's different in India and the United States. In the United States, however, there are 500 TV shows available for watching at this time, nearly 500, by way of streaming services and television. Every time I go to a party and full of writers, there's some nice words exchanged about novels, and then people talk about TV shows. I also know this, that in my years in the United States, at least the Bush years that I spent in the United States, which I hated beyond words, no better work of narrative art was produced than The Sopranos, dealing with those 8 or 10 years of iniquity. No novel comes close to that. No novel was able to incorporate the experience as it was happening. No novel confronted the false notions of leadership and the moral corruption of the notion of leadership in America and all this than The Sopranos. Similarly, The Wire, the war on drugs in the United States, there's a number of newspaper articles and nonfiction books, but no novel has addressed the iniquity of the whole notion of war on drugs, how it affects individual lives, than The Wire. I'm fully committed to literature, including writing novels, because I believe, to the same extent as David, the power of language and the power of imagination, the necessity of imagining, and not just watching, imagining other people's lives and the way they live and they operate daily. But the monopoly of the novel as the way into other people's life, as the primary way of engaging with other people's lives, is diminished. Partly because of the rise of visual narrative forms, long forms, as in television shows, but also because of the diminishment of public space all across the board. The press is partly, or the diminishment of press is partly responsible for the diminishment of the novel.
Margaret, do you agree?
I agree in part, but I would ask you to do the following thought experiment. So The Sopranos, you have it on, let's say you've got it on in a boxed set, and you're 20 years into the future from now, and you give this box set to a 15-year-old of that time. Would they be able to understand it?
I don't know.
I'll leave you with that thought. So what you're saying is that at the time, it was taking you into the reality of the time. I think one thing that the novel can do is that it can take you into the reality of the time that it has been recording for a much longer time into the future than television shows can do, because a television show like that assumes that the audience knows what you're talking about, whereas the novel will give you more of a context, and it can also take you deeper into the consciousness of characters than any other art form can do. From a neurological standpoint, much more of the brain lights up when you're reading than it does when you're watching television. You know, it's not that I don't love these series, of course, we do. But you were saying, what do people talk about at dinner parties? Gatherings of writers that I am familiar with, they never talked about novels. They talked about car insurance. They didn't want to talk about novels. It was too touchy. They were all writers. They didn't have to get into saying what they thought of each other's work. That's very dangerous. So I think people talk about things that are easy for them to talk about, and it's a lot easier to talk about television shows than it is to talk about your personal experience of a novel that has affected you deeply, because you don't want to start sniveling at the dinner table. And it's also a lot easier to talk about, you know, food and clothing, which is why there are so many food and clothing magazines. Why are there no glossy magazines with a lot of perfume ads in them devoted to the novel? You know, it doesn't fit.
Sasha, do you want to respond to that?
I would not like anyone to think that there's opposition, that I'm rooting for the TV shows. What I'm saying is that for whatever reason, which is interesting in itself, might be interesting in itself, the power has been diminished. I root for the novel. I'd rather read novels than watch TV shows, and I don't watch many TV shows.
Yeah, the comparative power has been diminished, but the absolute number of people reading has increased, and Lord knows the number of people writing and writing novels or aspiring to write novels has become an explosion. Thank you very much, creative writing classes, which often give their students a quite false idea of what it is to be a professional writer, of which I have to say only 10%, even in North America, make their living at writing.
I think you're absolutely right that it's easier because language is longer lasting than images, so it's much more profitable and easier and better to engage with times and places outside of your immediate experience in language. But it's also, literature has been taught, as badly as it is taught in the United States, has been taught. The modes of interpretation have been taught. I can imagine a class, I have taught classes teaching movies from 50 years ago where students didn't have a context, they could not understand illusions. But educational system can lead you into that. Television it's easy to dismiss. I have dismissed it. I'm still dismissing it as a lesser form of art. And I'm not rooting and claiming that television will displace and kill the novel. What I'm saying is that the novel has lost some power. It has retreated, and into that space, long-form television has moved.
And I'm just going to take it to the Sulaiman's.
No, I just want to come. Going back to when I grew up in Saudi Arabia, I was, like I said, we would go and try to buy banned books and stuff like that because they were extremely important for us to read about the outside world, because it gives you a black and white perspective of the Christian, the Western world, and I think the reading novels, it kind of gives you a nuance, it kind of gives you a detail, a perspective, a relevant perspective of, written by this, by people from the West. And I remember very well reading Tayyip Saleh, for example, Season Migration to the North. And in it, it was this Sudanese man who went back from London to a village in Sudan. And so they asked him, how about, could you tell us something about the West? How do they look like? What do they think about? So he said, they people like us, they have dreams, some are frustrated, some are realized. So for me, growing up, in this context of black and white, it was extremely important to realize that actually we all are human. So in this sense, I think a novel is extremely relevant and powerful, and it gives you, it's just a nuance, a forum, I guess, to the outside world, yeah.
But I have to say I'm a little on Sasha's side here, because certainly the world I inhabit, more people watch TV shows and more people seem, and Margaret, when we talked, I know that I'm going to try and nuance this as much as possible, but I probably will get it all wrong. But certainly in the world I inhabit, more people watch TV shows than read. I don't know, Sunjeev, if you agree. And it doesn't mean that the novel isn't relevant, but when Sasha talks about the diminishing power of the novel, it just means that you find less people feeling excited about, as a publisher, it pains me, but I think about it a lot.
None of my friends read novels. Not even mine. They just. But one of them said.
They were all desperate. I think they're not in the mic.
Oh, is that better? Oh, sorry. Okay. I was saying none of my friends read novels, and one of them said to me, "Oh, I wish I was the kind of person who did read novels." I thought, what does that mean? So there's some sort of status associated, or some sort of snobbery in some quarters about novel reading, and I wonder if novels have always been reading novels, a bit of a minority support in England at least, and then maybe it's in that lies their power to actually be so powerful. That actually reading is tough. Reading is like a muscle that you have to work at time and time and time again, and it's not easy to read a book properly. I think reading a book is just as hard as writing a book actually most of the time, and very few people can kind of think read well and read closely. So I wonder if novels have ever had that much power. Maybe the diminishment is, how much I think perhaps they've always been sort of for a few people.
Could we ask everybody why they write them? Why do you write them?
Why do I write them?
Yes.
Because I find reading more than writing. I'm more of a reader than a writer. I could give up writing. I don't think I'd give up reading. I think it's my way of this imagined space, which I think we spoke about earlier, and seeing people go through their lives in this hypothetical arena is a way for me to go through my life in a better way. I think that's the best way I can put it.
Okay. Given that, why do you then publish them?
Because I don't think a novel is fully complete until a reader meets you halfway in.
So would you be happy if only one person read it?
I would be.
Yeah, I think I'd be fine.
I would be. Yeah, I would be.
I'd be fine as long as it's published and it's out there, and it's there for. It's like it's a bridge, or it's like a table across which people can sit and meet, and as long as there's people happy to dine at that table, then I'm happy.
I want to take Margaret's point about the novel and the future. The idea of the novel 100 years after it's written, having relevance, and not only relevance, but being a sort of shimmering, glittering form that changes as time changes. And I want to, for example, look, this is the 100th anniversary of the 1916 rebellion in Dublin. But it's also the 100th anniversary of the time when James Joyce began seriously to work on his novel Ulysses, which was published 6 years later at the time of Irish independence. And while Ulysses seems, for example, formally tricky, structurally sumptuous, it's very hard to imagine Joyce thinking that he was also writing a book which was morally serious. But the more we think about the book now, the more we read it 100 years after its publication, the more we realize that he was preaching, that he was involved in prophecy, that he was attempting, as the first country to remove itself from the British Empire to become a republic, preaching to that country, Ireland, and preaching to the other countries who would too get away from the empire, as to what sort of country you would build by producing an everyman, by putting a Jewish man at the center of a novel in a Catholic country, by having him walking in the city, by making the city the center of the universe, which of course, in a country filled with nationalism, filled with Ireland getting the city, the streets, and the encounters on the streets with every type of person, as a book which really mocked nationalism, which suggested there's another way to live in the world other than to be someone locked into your nation, that yourself has another way of expanding. And by allowing that figure of Leopold Bloom, the everyman, to live as a failure in one way, but his consciousness to be so rich, so glittering, so pure, was some way of suggesting to his country that in the future, perhaps, there was a way of being open about sexuality, open about desire, open about even consciousness itself. So 100 years later, this novel, which at the beginning just seemed like a moment in modernism, almost preaching to the novel itself as to how the novel could open, actually becomes a novel preaching to a society, or at least offering a society images of immense strength, which would in some way or other reach into the core of the society to see if there was, even as a parable, to show, at least for some readers, there is another way to live in Ireland other than as a nationalist, other than as a pure and only Irish person, or as a Catholic person, or even as a man. That to allow a woman to speak at the end of the book and to speak about her sexuality was a revolutionary act in Ireland in those years. And even though the book did not, and even though of course the book did not find a lot of readers immediately, it has had a strange and abiding influence over those 100 years, which I think is one way to teach us as novelists what the novel can actually do.
But Colm, I'm going to...
for you.
So, my question to you would be is, can you imagine a time when the Ulysses of the future is a TV show or a film? I mean, the world, people are going to hopefully ask enormous and important questions in all kinds of ways. We're looking at a particular form and wondering what makes this form abide and what makes this form particular, right? And so one of the points that I think that's kind of come up here is that perhaps only the novel can do this and nothing else. But could you imagine a time, or do you think that's not the case?
Imagine a time when what? Sorry.
That the Ulysses of the future, a story that's prophetic, that's profound, that asks big questions, can be done in a form that's a TV show, let's say.
Well, there have been some excellent television series. One of the most, you probably all remember The Singing Detective. No, you don't. Yes, you do. From years ago, it was revolutionary in its moment, and you can watch that now with no sense that you're living, that this thing was made 30 years ago. So it's possible to do those things, but you almost have to really get into the consciousness of a character. You almost have to use either voiceover, hallucination, or a lot of the Bergman-esque ways of treating character that take you right into somebody's mind and how they're thinking, which is what in fact Ulysses did. I just asked Sasha whether he was watching Game of Thrones, and he isn't. So that isn't the kind of TV show that you're thinking of, no. But a huge number of people, I think it had the largest viewership of any television series ever. And what does that tell us?
I might get around to watching it. But
well, it's based on European history, only with dragons.
But I want to, Ulysses is one of the most important books in my life. I spent time reading it and formulated my thinking about literature and my writing years ago, and I keep returning to it. The advantage of I think that Ulysses has the advantage of being unconsumable because it retains the sovereignty of language and this simultaneously the sovereignty of a particular experience in a particular place at a particular time. It also it projects outwards. So you can never finish interpreting it. And this is possible in language. I think it is possible to, of course, treat films and TV series as masterpieces of human mind and readdress them and return to them over time. But I believe, as a writer and as a person of language, that language has advantage over images because they last longer. I mean, the language lasts longer. Images do not last that long, and because they pass through us in some ways. And for us to fully understand them, in some ways they have to be converted into language. We have to re-narrate them in language. This is why Shakespeare lasts. This is why so many books last. This is why great works, I read Ulysses in translation the first time some years ago. Whoa. They can even outlive translation. A book like Ulysses, it can outlive translation. So I'm not arguing for the superiority of television or even to, increase attention to television. It seems to me it's a fact of this moment. And this is what I was addressing. But I'm fully committed to language and literature. That's me.
Well, the other thing about writing is that you do not need a huge amount of money invested up front to do it.
Right.
So you with your piece of paper or your typewriter, you can be writing away all by yourself. All you need is space to do it in and enough nutrition going in one end to keep you alive, and coffee, and you can write. Insofar as you're literate, you can write something. And if you finish that and get an agent and publisher, the initial investment into writing that book has just been you. It's just been you. Whereas for a television series, it's already millions and millions of dollars. So it's always done by a team. They're always cognizant of what they think will play. I will not tell you, yes I will, I'll tell you, about some of the scripts that have been written of my work that involved such things as topless women warriors. These did not get made, but it is a team of people sitting around thinking, what do you think they'll like? I know, topless women warriors. If you were a woman warrior, wouldn't you just take off your top so you could go out and shoot people? It's an absurdity, but it is this team saying, what is going to appeal? What's going to get us the biggest viewership? So how much of an individual are you seeing reflected in series? Really not much of a one because of the enormous amounts of money that are on the table. Whereas with a novel, good or bad, it is still the work of one individual, usually. It is the human voice, and that is worth a lot.
The title of this gathering is the Global Novel,
Yeah.
which is a title that I could not understand until I got here. And I think maybe we have to make a little distinction and to redefine it. Maybe when we say the global novel, we think of novels that became global, like a new brand of a car sometimes. Suddenly there is this or that book that sweeps us all and we read it and we enjoy it. But maybe we should look for not the global novels, but for the universal novels. And these are novels that remain. You asked Sasha before, in 20 years, how many kids would remember Sopranos. Novels that formulated for us something that no other vehicle of opinion, of mind, of imagination have done. I think, if I think of Metamorphosis of Kafka, of Ulysses, of many others, who formulated to us something that is so deep and so existential. Maybe we should call it the existential novel. Yes, novels that without them we would not have been the persons we are, by the way, even if we have not read them. But you cannot live today in this world without being a little Kafkaesque or Kafkaesque oriented, or even Ulysses in a way. Ulysses is more specific, I think. And I think maybe this is the question we should ask ourselves. What makes a novel that is written today a universal one, a novel that might remain? You know, what is this thing that defines us? And you, Sulaiman, you mentioned the period of the migration to the north, written by a Sudanian writer, Tayyib Salah. I remember myself as a child almost. I think I was 15 when I first read it in a translation. I come from Israel. I knew nothing of Sudan. I mean, it was a country of the enemy. And of course, when you have an enemy, you don't try really to understand the fibers of the existence of this enemy, and you don't look at him as a human being, because, I mean, if you want to kill someone, you have to dehumanize him first. And then suddenly this book entered my life, and I remember how fascinated I was and how deep it touched me, and how for the days that I was reading it, suddenly I was able to put myself in this little village in Sudan and to see that it evocates new things within me. You know, the Sudanian parts of me, the denied Sudanian parts of me that have never been revealed and never saw the light, it touched them and gave them light. And in that sense, for me, this is the universal novel.
Sunjeev, I mean, we're going to open it up to questions, but as the younger people in this panel, and I feel like there is a kind of division here, because, and I want to end on that division, which is that I think everyone's agreed that, you know, we love and believe in the novel, and that it does things that nothing else does. But are you, as a young writer, sometimes tempted to try something else?
I'm not so far, other than maybe adapting one of my novels for another format, which I might try to, but other than that, it's the novel for me. It's the place I go to for sanctuary, I guess, for sort of a refuge in those sentences, and for and I think I feel most at home when I'm at my desk reading. I think that's, so for me there's never been anything else other than novel in terms of having to go at or practicing a particular art form. It seems to me like it's one of the few things, without being too grand about it, sort of in my life, that I do think is worth just living and dying for.
Sulaiman, you get the final answer. Do you ever feel tempted? You said that, you know, you came to the for you, reading novels was a time, it was always dangerous to read novels when you began to read it. And so for you, writing the novel must also have some of that danger, that you bring some of that memory.
I think the danger for me comes from the publishing world. Because I think as a writer from a different background, I think I'm coming from Saudi Arabia, I absolutely detest censorship. And I think for the past 6 years, for example, I've been writing, 8 years actually, I've been writing my second book. I've kind of isolated myself from the world and everything, and I was just going into it, and then suddenly I finished and I'm showing it to people, and then everything is boom, you know, like, oh, you can't do this because the Western reader can't get this, or you can't say this because the West is too much for the Western. You know, it's this idea of censorship, I think, that prevent the universal novel that you were talking about. This idea of certain expectation of writers from my background, you know. And so I'm absolutely a free human being. I basically don't give a damn, or I was gonna say a fuck, but I'm not supposed to swear. But you know, it's really important that we need to talk about the publishing world in relation to writers from my background, because I think it needs discussion, because it needs to stop, and it needs, because it's kind of curtailing our creativity of doing the things we want to do. just because there's this imaginary Western reader who, for me, becomes like a lazy, ignorant, someone incapable of transcending different, societies, which is not the case, So, thank you.
So I'll put a concluding question and then open it up to questions to anyone around this table who'll be up for it. We've talked about the novel being universal. That it has the power to be universal. We've all avoided this word global novel. We're wholly suspect of it. But Sulaiman's thrown a challenge, which is he says that if you're writing as a Sudanese, Eritrean, British novelist, it's harder to write a novel that everyone will want to read because there's a world out there that's conspiring to make sure that these novels are not published or not read. Do you around this table think that the idea of the universal novel might have something to do with where you come from?
Well, I live in Dublin, which is a very literary city, meaning it's filled with laughter and mockery. And everyone reads, and everyone thinks they could write a book, and most people think, and they're right, they could write a better book than you write. And if you went into a bar in Dublin and said, oh, I'm busy at the moment, I can't talk to you, I'm writing a global novel, people would laugh so much at you that you would have to take the boat to Holyhead, and you'd have to go and live in England, to get away, just to get away from the mockery and the laughter. I mean, the issue is, I think, that the novel, as you work, is a tentative form, that it's 1,000 details. If it's a long novel, it's 2,000 details. You're working slowly on those details. You're trying to make them true. If you make something true enough, it will hit a reader in many other countries. But this battle of, for example, mentioning an Irish political party, putting in a reference to Irish history, and someone in London telling you, we can't do footnotes for this book. Readers, meaning English readers, won't understand this word. Could you soften all that Irish stuff? And the answer, of course, has to be no. Yeah. The reader I am writing for, the person who lives next door to me. If the rest of the world wants to listen in, please listen in. And the other thing, of course, is the listening in becomes immensely powerful, as you were talking about, that for example, my grandfather fought against the British and was imprisoned by the British. But the idea that he would not read Charles Dickens, the idea that he would not read Shakespeare, would have been anathema to him. Somehow or other, those novels came from England to Ireland as a great gift from England. Other things that came from England weren't such a gift. But the literature mattered. Thomas MacDonagh, who went out to lead the 1916 rebellion, he had a chance to give one last class to his students at University College Dublin. He knew he would be shot. And one last class, what was it about? Irish mythology? No, Jane Austen. He said, he won my one last chance to teach Jane Austen. And that is the power of what we do. Thank
Oh,
you.
I'll share with you the fact that some Irish nationalists once invaded Canada with the idea of conquering it and then trading it for Ireland with Britain.
If only.
They didn't succeed, but think if they had, history would have been different.
We'll open this floor up for questions. I think people are clamoring. I think we'll take some questions up front, first of all.
Share a microphone.
Hello, I'm on the left side of the stage. Hi, under the sun. Hi, here. Hi. Thank you for the thought-provoking session. So my question is for Sunjeev. You mentioned in a previous session that the characters in your novel, The Year of the Runaways, are constantly running from a previously occupied identity. Do you think they also come to a realization of identity? And how do you think the space of the novel operates in identity construction, especially in a quote-unquote global world, be it for the characters or the readers or the author? Thank you.
Can you repeat the
question? So the characters in my novels, The Year of the Runaways, it's about 4 people who find themselves in Sheffield. 3 of them are from India, one's from a difficult home life in London, and they do forge identities for themselves by the end of the book. In particular, all of them, as you say, are running away from a place where they don't really feel they have a say in their own life. They don't really feel they can make choices in terms of how their life, the path of their life can go, what path they can take. And by the end of the novel, they do have choices, but the interesting thing I think is that those choices are also imprisoning in their own way. So there is a sense that whatever identity you might go towards, or you might think you want, it brings its own walls with it. Is the novel a good place for exploring issues of identity? Well, I think it always has been to date, and it's connected to some of those points where you discussed earlier around the novel being sort of the only place where you can really get inside someone's head, and it's a space where you can foster those empathies and those ways, those feelings with people who are completely different to you, whether it's Stephen Dedalus or whether it's a butler in the 30s, whether it's Salim Sinai, in Midnight. It's the place where you can be anyone, and through being anyone, because it is such an intimate one-on-one, and you in your own space, you're almost just you're being your most self as well. So I think the novel is one of the best place to actually look at some of those questions of who you are and why you are who you are.
I don't know where the mic there.
Hi, it's right. Thank you very much. Margaret, Gerhard Richtler has written about Montreal and his community of early 20th century. The same things that I can very well relate to as a community member in Mississauga today. So that sense, it is a very global appeal. And it is understood. However, I would like to ask the panelists next to you and yourself about this other phenomena that took over, the HP factor, Harry Potter factor, which covered both the film as well as a best-selling global phenomenal novel. So how do you place those two in context of the globalization of novel as well as a media-occupied territory?
Well, first of all, they're fantasy. So they're in the realm of the wonder tale and the fairy tale, and those are pretty universal forms. But second, this was children's literature. And children's literature does tend to be able to cross borders fairly easily because it's dealing with pretty simple ideas and characters and appealing to stuff that children pretty universally like, which is tell me a wonderful story in which people can fly, etc. So it's not to put that in the same basket as Ulysses, although they have some things in common. They're prose narratives, and they contain wonder tales, which Ulysses does. What's the question really? Why is it of such universal appeal? Not hard to tell. It's a lot of fun. Will it influence you when you're, well, let's not even go there.
I have 2 little daughters. My older daughter, she's 8. She read all of the Harry Potter books by the age of 7. And she continued reading all other books. She's a compulsive reader. And so we encouraged her to read Harry Potter or anything she wanted. But my stipulation was that she could not watch any movies until she read all of the books.
Oh, good.
And so she read all of the books, and then she started watching movies. It took her a year to see all the movies. And she would get scared because there are dragons and creatures and, suspense. And this is the difference between language and images. in movies and TV shows too, they stimulate the senses directly. So there's, something explodes and startles you, and then you react to it. Whereas a reading is always inside your mind, inside your head, and you have to construct a reality. So she would be startled and scared by the movies, and she would stop watching the movie in the middle of it, and they would go back to the book and reread the same passage, similar passage, and then go back to the movies. So she enjoys the movies, but they never took her off the reading path, not for a moment, because in some ways they're separate activities. They are, connected, obviously, but they're separate. She, because of her reading habits, which were encouraged, to say the least, by Harry Potter, she's one of those people, kids, who's able to be alone with herself for a very long time, and without sensory stimulation. So when we go on long trips, she does not need to watch movies. She brings a book with her. So I think Harry Potter, as Margaret said, it's easy to imagine because it encompasses all these myths that we're all familiar with, and children are familiar with instinctively, as it were. And then the movies completed that work, I suppose.
We can take one last question, I think, and I don't know where the mic is.
Hi.
Okay.
So my question is to Colm. I just recently read Brooklyn, and it was a fantastic book, but I'd heard of it because it was an Oscar-nominated film. I haven't watched the film, but I suspect it's a good film because it's Oscar-nominated. So do you think that the process of book writing and probably filmmaking is far less divisive as probably it's made out to be, and a much more collaborative effort to just make audiences more aware of either literature or things that happen around them? So it's not as divisive as we make it out to be. It's not film versus novel writing, but it's just a more collaborative effort.
I think it depends very much on the people you work with. That in other words, they could have taken the novel Brooklyn and they could have made her English, and they could have said an English girl goes to Brooklyn. But by sticking to the story, in other words, I began by asking, the first question I asked was, can you get me Nick Hornby to write this screenplay? Because I thought Nick Hornby, would be faithful to the book, and he has a sort of magic in the way he touches things that I don't have. So I wanted him to do that. I also looked really carefully into the eyes of the producer, and I liked her. And I thought she was someone I could trust, and I was right about that. Her own mother had emigrated to New Zealand from Ireland in precisely the same year. The story mattered to her. And then they built the story around the idea that this might be a story that matters to people. They were, in general, faithful to the book. They added an ending, and that's the strangest part because I didn't write that ending. I stopped it just before that ending. I'm not going to tell you what the ending is, but what happens to me when I watch it, I've had to watch it about 6 times at various festivals. I start crying at the bit I didn't write. It moves me more than the rest of it.
Do we have time for one more question? No, I've been commanded to end this session. I think they'll all be at their signing tables and you can hound all your authors there with your questions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
With this, we come to the end of yet another session here at Charbagh. We would like to thank our speakers for the brilliant session, along with ZEE Entertainment for sponsoring this session. Margaret Atwood will not be available at the book signing area, but has graciously signed pre-signed copies, which will be available at the Full Circle bookstore. Thank you so much. Please help us in making sure that the next session starts on time and the authors have an enjoyable time at the Lit Fest as you do. Please do not crowd near the stage. Thank you so much.